I'm Mark Branson. I work with TMN and the Journal and teach congregational leadership and mission at Fuller Theological Seminary. Um, and I had a great few days with Sally and Dave and folks in East London this summer, so I can get into more of those stories, but let my friends introduce themselves.
I'm Danny Fong, and I am a founding pastor of a church plant in San Francisco in the Bayview-Hunters Point neighborhood. We've been at it for 15 years, and we've been in touch with a different missional conversation, maybe not formally this way, but it certainly has guided our thinking and our sense of what it means to follow God's initiatives.
Nina, my wife and I just had a great weekend with Danny and the church up in the Bay Area and continue to be just inspired by the stories and the ways that they're living life in the Bayview. So maybe both connecting with the Acts 16 passage that you were talking about and some of your own engagement there at Bayview.
Well, maybe I should start with, since folks are from all over, the Bayview-Hunters Point is a neighborhood that some would call one of the abandoned places of the empire. And so it's a place where, it's history. It's just has a lot of migration, a lot of immigrants, a lot of poverty. Our city is a place where, for varying reasons, the public schools in our neighborhood are not supported and are not very functional, given we actually have kind of a market system in how people enroll for school. And so if you're living in this neighborhood, you choose out. And so it just decimates the community. But like other parts of San Francisco, we also have gentrification. We have the tech companies kind of moving from south to north. My own congregation, as we planted, a lot of us actually were also professionals. It's a largely Asian American congregation. And we were trying to find our way and, well, what does God want us to be? The core group came out of another church that was in the neighborhood called the Mission. They were in the center of the city, and all we knew was that we wanted to go to some other place where we could practice being the church, seeking the kingdom, and in places where maybe others were not. And so we had a very long and circuitous route. After 15 years, we've been in 4 different locations, and right now we have less than a year left on the lease that we're in. And so the Acts 16 passage, where the Apostle Paul has a vision to go to Macedonia, has that vision of a man saying, come over, begging him to come and help. He ends up there, and I don't need to tell all the story, but he ends up being led there and finding a woman named Lydia and not finding her normal or his normal strategy. He goes to the city center, but doesn't find a synagogue, ends up outside the gate. And so all this kind of circuitous, fluid kind of following, I feel like that's been our story. Maybe I can just tell one about how we ended up where we are. As a congregation that has many Chinese Americans who actually were born and raised in San Francisco, they were told to not go to the Bayview. It's not safe for you there. It's violent there. It's like, you don't go there. And so when we first started, we were looking in a certain corner of the city where a lot of us lived, and we said, well, maybe this neighborhood, maybe this neighborhood, maybe that neighborhood, but probably not the Bayview, because I don't think we can see ourselves going there. And as God would have it, in the story of Acts 6, doors closed. We try to go to Outer Mission, we try to go to Ingleside, and the doors closed on that. And when we were in our first space, which was in the neighborhood that I live in and walking distance from where I live now, we just outgrew it and couldn't stay there. And so we were still looking in our neighborhood, and we ended up in this place where, it was a shabby place. It was a body shop, auto body shop, and the realtor just said, you don't want to go there. You can't put a church in there. And so then he directed us over to the Bayview, and then we ended up on the edge of the Bayview for a lot of years. And so, well, this is where we are, at least for the next 5 years. So we had a lease. And so then we started going out, and I'll just tell one of the groups that we ended up connecting with was a school, and ended up being in partnership with them for many years. And there was also a couple of churches that really welcomed us. And so this kind of going out and being received, that led us to staying in the Bayview. And if I jump really far is also a very circuitous route with all this involvement with that particular school as well as our own public schools, and then coming to the realization that even though we had so much commitment to public school, we got to the point where we realized that these were not salvageable, and we felt like the Lord was leading us to start our own school. And so we started Rise University Prep, middle school that we think will go on to being a high school eventually, but this is our first year, and we're still trusting and risking and following. So that's just a little bit.
So let me just play into one of the things that Sally talks about, is trying to figure out how to describe herself. As a philosophy professor who also teaches social studies and other things at the local community college, from what I hear in you also, you're constantly doing theology. Your church has changed how it views God and walking with God during these years. Can you describe some of that, just what you've seen go on among the people during this engagement?
Well, following along in this missional conversation, I know that Luke 10 and the sending out of the 70 is a very key text. And so our congregation did Lectio on Luke 10 for, I don't know, I'm going to say 6 months. Every Wednesday.
A lot of correspondence during that.
And so during that period, we were trying to shift that mentality that somehow, God is, we do believe that God is, there's a way in which God's particularly present in the gathered people, but that didn't necessarily need to equate to that it's in this particular building and then you invite them all into this place. And so we were intrigued by the idea of going out 2 by 2 and finding places of welcome. And so to find that, God's at work out there. And so we can't actually discern God's initiatives without being out in the neighborhood and listening to folks and walking the streets and praying and just meeting folks and engaging in the neighborhood. And so that's, I think we've always believed that God was out there, but to go out and to discern it. And so I have a very regular sending that I do now where I say, we're sent out to a God-blessed world where God is present and sent to all the places that, we're going to all these places that we're sent to, and we're looking for God there. So.
Now there's also a way, even as you were beginning, if I remember right, work with Chi Ming, others, that the whole business, the understanding labor and business as part of how you live life as a church and a community has been also part of your imagination and practices from the beginning. Can you say something about that?
Yeah. Well, there's so much there. And so I should say that before I was called to plant this church, to lead this church plant, we had started a business. It was in technology, in consulting, web development, and mobile development now. And we had this vision where my wife and Chi Ming's wife were both serving in the youth ministry. Actually, I myself was a volunteer as well. And so we were ministering to these kids where, yes, you give them, you have the youth group, you have the fun, you have the prayer, you have the scripture and all that, but we also recognized that they were just coming out of, they were just challenged in terms of being able to just stay in school or to be able to go to college and all that. And so we wanted to take the skills that we had and say, well, what can we do with this? So I feel like that business has been going for 20 years. We just celebrated 20 years and we still feel like it's very much an experiment. And so one of the major things that happened about 3 years ago is that instead of being downtown where you would normally have a technology consulting company, we really felt like if God's called us to embody and bear witness to his redeeming work in the workplace, marketplace, and community, that maybe that community part needed to have more shape to it. And so they moved the company, we, because I'm still involved as a director, moved the company into the Bayview. And so now we're sharing space together. And that's actually this last space that Redeemer Church has, we couldn't have if we weren't sharing space with the tech company. And so out of that, we asked, okay, now that we're together, how can we bless the neighborhood? And so Chi Ming, the president of the company, he got a sabbatical. And during that time, he basically walked the streets of the Bayview, especially 3rd Street, the main corridor. And he noticed all these small businesses, but he also noticed all these boarded up businesses. He also noticed, the loan sharks and the different, kind of things there. And just had the sense that, one way that we could use our gifts for what we're seeing in the neighborhood. And he also went into shops. He has a really funny story about how the Luke 10 thing, you walk into these shops and you go in with no money and they offer you water because you're not supposed to have a purse. And so you get into these conversations and you hear about their lives, and many of them are immigrants. And then, so anyways, we came out with this idea that, we can support these local business because we could do a revolving loan fund, and we have some business experience. And so now we've been running this loan fund for folks who would not be able to get a loan in a bank. As a matter of fact, I'm always just impressed whenever we get a payment. Now, most of them are actually doing very well in payment back. But what I'm trying to say is that we get the payments in the form of money orders and cashier's checks. It's like these businesses aren't even able to, or at least maybe they don't trust banks or whatever, that they're really on the ground just getting, in terms of how they practice their economics. And so that's one slice of the business and the church coming together and being in the neighborhood and following God's lead.
Yeah, so in that way, there's this kind of ripple effect through the community and the families of the community, among especially immigrant and other marginalized. There's some also, if I remember right, some connections with job training with some of the youth or some of the young adults.
Yeah, the job training was in our earlier days. That's how we got started. We were back in a church that sent us out. And so we were in the Mission District, which has a lot of the same, profile. And so we started with job training. Yeah. One more thing that I wanted to mention about the loan fund, if you let me, is that we wanted to change this dynamic of, those with money and that have the power and those who are receiving the money. And so we have as a goal to have loan recipients on the loan committee as part of the conversation, sharing meals, getting to know one another, and those stories and getting to know one another. They also participate in deciding about the next batch of loans that we do.
Yeah, it's that kind of the layered normal life is complex with income and business and schools and kids and immigrants and long-term residents. And there's ways in which that complexity has simply become part of normal life for you as Redeemer Church. That you understand that the gospel is a part of all of those layers.
Yes. I think that after 15 years, our congregation has gotten used to the idea that you only know the next step. And recently, when we were looking at Acts 16, I just pressed myself, what do you think it was like for Paul to be stopped? He tried to go south to Asia and he couldn't go. He tried to go north to Bithynia, I think it was called, and he couldn't go. And I said, what do you think it was like it's like, how do you think the Holy Spirit blocked them or stopped them? And at first they weren't sure they wanted to say frustration, but it's not the easiest, to make plans and say, because right now we'd love to have an extension on our lease, but we're not getting it. And in another couple months, we'll probably know whether or not we're going to have to look again. And every time we've looked, God's always provided, but there's always been this kind of nervous, like, is it going to happen? And, hearing Sally's story, hopefully she'll be able to come up and tell it herself. I realized, okay, if the next step for us is to actually not have a space or not have because that's kind of traditional church, right? You have a building where you come and you gather and you worship. And we've actually had that all 15 years, but we get to a place where we just, because of the gentrification and some things that are going on, we might not be able to afford to actually have a space. And we're just talking about renting here. We're not talking about, some big building that we're paying down and buying. We just want a place to gather.
Mm-hmm. And I remember one of those early welcomes was an African-American church that invited you to share in their property with them and the relationships that were all part of that in your early life there in Bayview. Yes,
that was really fun. Our previous experience, and that we might actually go back to that. Almost all the churches in the Bayview Hunters Point are historically African-American. And now because of the changing demographics, many of them will house a Spanish-speaking church, Samoan church, maybe even a church like us. And so the last time we looked for space, we basically had our connections in the neighborhood. And we actually said we're Presbyterians, so our session said that, if there's a church here who would host us, we'd go there first. And so we actually did that. And we thought of it as this great adventure of what would it look like to share space with another church and be neighbors in that way. And we ended up doing all kinds of stuff together. We had Vacation Bible School together. We had this alternative Halloween festival together. We did we did joint worship services, and with very different styles and very different preaching styles and worship styles. We had to do the very, basic stuff, literally, of how do we share the same room, and it was a great experience.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things when Nina and I were with you, and just seeing the congregation there on retreat, that you're part of this has also been ways in which God is drawing. While your core was Asian American and even primarily Chinese American, God's been mixing that group up a bunch over the last few years.
Well, that's a very live conversation for us, and so we qualify as multiracial based on the
way to do data.
But I think we are finding, and especially in today's climate, that racialization, and there's some just really real barriers that prevent folks from joining a church like ours. And but yes, that is a key part of our vision, and we continue to reach out. And yes, we are multi-ethnic now, but we're still largely Asian American, and we're having conversations about what that means. And we set out to be Asian American from the very beginning. It was kind of funny. You're a mostly Asian American church, and you say, we don't want to be an Asian American church. We want to be a multi-ethnic church. And I think that after 15 years, you feel like, oh, you could look at the numbers and sort of feel like we wish we had more diversity in terms of numbers. But I feel like the kinds of real relationships and conversations that we're having now, we couldn't have had if we didn't have the kind of trust and long-term relationship built that's gotten to this place. And so we had one series of conversations that we called East Meets West. And in the midst of that, I introduced Russell Jung's research, where he talked about Asian American-led multi-ethnic churches. And he talked about how non-Asian Americans in those churches could actually pay a really high cost emotionally and relationally in order to be there. He was particularly naming whites, whites who are not used to being the minority in a congregation. And our congregation functions out of majority Asian American sensibilities and culture. And so after a long time, it can be hard. And so we had folks able to say, yeah, that actually is true for me. And for our congregation to hear that and to feel the pain, and sort of like, some people wanted to, well, how can we fix that? How can we, but we love you and all that. And you just realize that, well, these dynamics that we say are kind of out there, they're also in here too. And so now what's next with that? I don't know, but we took a break for a while because people were kind of upset when we got to the end of that conversation. You dropped this bomb on us at the end of the conversation. So I just, that's okay. Well, it's been, I don't know, it's been quite a few months, and now we're planning on picking up the conversation in January. And I'll just say the idea of having live conversations like this, I felt also came from some of this missional stuff that we're doing, because our congregation, our background is, and especially Presbyterian, right? You do Bible study, you get together, you do Bible study, but now we have a lot more of, we get together and we have conversation. We do lectio and have the scripture ground us, and then see where that goes, trying to make connections to our own lives and our attentiveness to the neighborhood. And so we've really changed. You were talking about theology earlier. Now, I think this is theology, but it's also very much practice. We have very tradition practices in terms of when you gather, what you do. You do Bible study, you do prayer, and we're still doing scripture, and we're still praying, we're still listening, but the paradigm has shifted over the years, and that's how we discern God's leading.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, on one hand, just for those of you who are listening in, Danny's wife, Cindy, is Euro-American white. Obviously, I am, and my wife is Chinese American. And so our own lives as in marriage and in family have these questions. They've been part of conversation relationships from the beginning. And there are ways then in the retreat where we had with your church, Nina especially was able to tell stories about being Chinese American in the US and the types of pressures and and discomforts and different issues that that raises. But then around your tables, as we gave questions about doing cultural autobiographies as a practice, for instance, and we did that parallel with Lectio, we did other things. But it was amazing just watching when we did this retreat with Redeemer Church. We'd asked Danny and Cindy if they wanted wanted middle school kids like involved, and we weren't sure how they were going to deal with conversations, and they were engaged. I mean, so all the tables had youth and young adults as well as older adults around these stories of ethnicity and racism and race. And it was just an amazing thing to watch, the level of engagement that was going on around those tables.
Well, because it's very live for them. You know, they go to public school, and in our city, in our neighborhood, you can't get around. It's not just on the TV. It's our everyday lives. So yeah, they're engaged because they have questions and they have real life experiences that they're trying to sort out.
Well, when I think about, like I say, I spent a couple of days with Sally and the gang in East London when we were just getting ready for a journal editorial meeting in August. And as I walked down the street with Dave, her husband, who's also part of the leadership, it was really amazing to me to watch. Everybody greeted him, from those that were selling drugs out of their car to others. I mean, everybody knew Dave. The relationships go deep. They've been going for years. And so one hand, there are those relationships. On the other hand, there was this, as they talk about it a little bit in the videos, just remarkable work with both developing schools, but also several acres of a recreation center where the city councilman was there that day playing some strange British game. And so all of this was part of life where, as Sally says in the video, 5 generations for her of living there.
Yeah.
So that's deep roots in a place and multi-layered education, street life, recreation. I think there's some shots of the vegetable garden that's all part of the community center. Building a community center that also then becomes a potential place at times where the worshiping community would gather. But that only comes with long-term engagement, doesn't it? That none of this stuff works, either if your focus is inside, what do we do in the building, or if the focus isn't grounded in the dirt of a place.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sense of, when you've been around longer, there's a sense of legitimacy. And so when I talked about the engagement with the local middle school, when we first started, okay, these are our neighbors, let's go out and gather. When we were first received with, okay, here's some more do-gooders, and they'll be around for a year, and they realize that they can't really do anything, they'll leave. And so they didn't really want to open up to us. But after the 7th, 8th year, when we were there all the way through to the end, when that school finally closed, we came on the last day of school, and one of the folks that we had been relating to just said, "We knew you'd be here," and she burst into tears. It says, "You guys have always been here for us," and you don't get that kind of welcome in just, like I said, in the first year. The first year, the folks are skeptical. They've seen so many, because if you're in an impoverished place, a lot of people want to help, but a lot of people come through and they have their idea of how to help, and then if it doesn't work out, they're gone. And so we also, we're trying to practice presence, because we realize that even though we have, as a congregation, we're educated, we have resources, and I mean, certainly enough skill to give a shot at starting our own school, we did have things to bring, but we wanted to come in that Luke 10 way of laying aside and receiving the hospitality of those who would open up their doors. And we asked, what would you like? What do you need? And that's how we formed our partnerships.
Yeah. It's related to the passages you've been connecting, which also we're a little over 3 years, maybe 3.5 years into a church plant here. And both Luke 10 and Acts 16 have been kind of long-term repeated engagements for us, just because of the way they stir us. So part of this is just naming practices, which I want to get into again, but for you, for us, extended times of lectio, of listening to the Holy Spirit with a text as we live lives in this place. Nina and our pastor Deborah had put together what we called Retreat on the Street, which was a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, where morning and evening we would connect, those who could, for reading the text. At that point it was Luke 10. And then they just said during the day, try to be more out in the neighborhood. Now we have jobs, we have school, but more than normal, be out of your home and wherever the neighborhood gathers, wherever the population is. And that ends up being stores and recreation centers and school at certain times of the day. And so we just kind of said, try to be with somebody else and be thinking about the passage, but then just listen for the Spirit among our neighbors. And out of that, there were a number of things that came, but one of the things that became obvious to us was, especially in the gathering places and especially in the businesses, there were certain businesses, and at this point I'm thinking more coffee, pubs, restaurants, types of places, where you saw the neighbors, and there are some of them where you didn't see any neighbors. They were close to the freeway and they drew people from other neighboring towns, but it really wasn't the neighborhood's place. And there was sort of kind of this stark difference of which places were neighbors and which places were part of, as you say, more the gentrified people coming in, not yet, at this point, not living here, but they kind of liked the quality of a place, and probably that somebody moved in because it was cheaper rent, things like that. And as we were just becoming aware of what it meant to be part of the economics of a community, and whether those economics were hiring, serving, engaged with the people on the ground, our neighbors. We also, totally without any initiative from us, there were 4 or 5 business people that came to somebody in our church, the pastor, me, Nina, someone, and just said, we've heard about your church and we're running X business. And we know for us, we're engaged a lot with young adults, and some young adults just out of prison or drug rehab. They said, we're kind of interested in whether that's part of what God wants us doing with our business. Now, we didn't solicit any of these. We're a tiny group. We're maybe 25 on Sundays. And yet we ended up with a number of business people, bike shop, florists, software, different things, saying, we're interested in working with you if there's ways these are supposed to connect. And what stunned us was none of this was our initiative. This was all, we have no idea why these people came up to us. And over that led to over a year, and Nina led this because Nina also was out of the tech finance world before we moved here to Pasadena. And in those conversations then, the different businesses decided to connect regularly and just ask what it meant to be a hospitable business, what it meant to be a place that lived in the midst of hospitality and welcome and grace in a neighborhood, and started changing their hiring practices, the way they understood customers and such, and even getting into what often is hard if you're working with young adults who haven't had any employment or the habits and practices of employment. It's more than teaching a couple technical skills, right? It's how do you help with a lot of life issues. And so that then became the experiment that came out of this. And originally, this is an Act 16 thing where you try things and you get frustrated and basically the answer is no. The hope had been that we could find a large enough space that these businesses could share and could also be a worship environment when we wanted that. A large warehouse, something like that. And just repeatedly, we couldn't get calls returned. We would try to, even the realtor would just say, I don't know why they don't return calls. They always return my calls before. And so just a consistent no, which is why Acts 16 was a pretty helpful passage for us, that what we were experiencing was what Paul was experiencing, but that doesn't mean you give up. It doesn't mean you fold. For him, it was move on. For us, it was continue to listen and dwell in the place because God's convinced us of that because of relationships. But both those passages and the practice of lectio and the practice of being in pairs, like with you, in the neighborhood where we could be reflective as we talk with people in these public places, really did change the whole nature of church for us. So same kind of practice. Can you name other practices other than lectio, than at times where you're in the neighborhood reflecting and listening in pairs? Are there other just kind of habits you're developing as a congregation that you think are helping you hear God?
In addition to lectio or listening to the neighborhood?
Yeah.
Well, when we were at our retreat, Mark and Nina led us to do some storytelling. And I realized that this I think is going to become a new practice for us, because I've been pairing it with Lectio actually recently, where where the text actually may guide to something, and then I'll ask the folks to go back into their groups and tell their own personal story. And if we can dovetail back to the cultural race conversation, what happened was when I tried to do my East meets West, and I tried to draw out differences in terms of Western culture and Eastern culture, we kind of got stopped because a lot of people just didn't agree with the categories, but they felt like, you know, this doesn't really name my culture, and my culture is a lot more complex than that. And so we couldn't even get started in the conversation. So at the retreat, Mark and Nina led us with some prompts that were all like, tell a story. And the one that I remember in the beginning was tell a cultural story. It was so wide open. It was just tell a cultural story. Don't try to define what your culture is. Whatever culture means to you, just you know, tell a cultural story. Maybe name some things that are cultural and that are important to you. And that was wide open, so people didn't get stopped at the I'm East and you're West, or I look East but I actually feel more West. We just didn't do. So we just like, let's just tell it as a personal story. And I felt like that's been really live for us. And I was just actually in another gathering, an Asian American gathering, talking about how could we give these Asian American gifts. And I realized that a lot of the Asian American folks, we are still like discerning, you know, who we are. And so one of the practices that he said you could do is that you could have a table, and then each person can bring an object that is a cultural, you know, that they identify with as their culture. Again, you don't have to define it. You could bring a picture of your family, you can bring food, you can bring whatever, and you can bring it to the table, and then you can tell a story about it. So I was starting to imagine that in this next round, maybe we can do that and have concrete physical objects that we even bring, because we're back home, we can bring it. We know we're going to do it on Wednesday night, so you bring it. And so, yeah, I think storytelling has become one of these, I think it can be, and it's already starting to get us out of that. Again, we have so much like analytical mode, you know, analytical discussion stuff. And so I feel like we discovered something with you in that retreat.
Alan, we got to get you in the middle of this, because you've both helped a lot of us with both Lectio and storytelling. What are you hearing in this?
Yeah, in terms of practices, what I'm seeing is that when you sit down around a table with, forgive the language, kind of ordinary people in congregations, not the leaders making big schemes, the stories are all there. It's just that most of the time, folk don't believe that their stories have any meaning or purpose, to quote God's greater picture. So the practice of just sitting and inviting stories to be told, it's stunning. For example, I was in another part of Canada the other week and just sat some people around a table, and one man began to describe how, as he walks about in his community, he sees people who tend to be, you know, somebody brushing the sidewalk or somebody sitting on their own reading a paper, and he's drawn to them. And he began to tell stories of the conversations that were coming out of that, but he had no conception that this was God at work in the community. And just sitting around a table, no big deal, inviting people to tell those stories, and then the practice of saying, that is where the Spirit is connecting with you and your community. That's going on all over the place. And the great news is you don't need an MDiv or a DMin to do that. That's kind of just ordinary human life. That's what God's percolating.
So shall we see if there's some questions among our participants? Feel free just to chat in any questions, and when we'll see them, SJ will remind us to read them. I can explore a little bit more on practices, I think. So we've talked about storytelling, Lectio, being out in the neighborhood. I liked your comment about Qiming Um, there were two things there. One is I want to emphasize, actually, as a business person, not everybody has the freedom to take a sabbatical, but there really are some in our churches who can to actually take a break from work. I remember as he started that of just saying there were certain, he was aware of questions he wanted to live with in that place, out of his life, in among the stories. And so for him to take some weeks away and spend, not head off for a retreat center, but to start walking into local businesses and asking for water and getting stories. I mean, those are just absolutely amazing practices, and they're within the reach of an awful lot of churches to be able to do those kind of things. And also for us, we're learning that because our homes, some of our homes, often because of youth, are gathering places for other youth, and how to live with the families that have that kind of hospitality. So it's one thing for one couple and one family to be a gathering place, but then are there appropriate ways that other adults can hang out during those hours and welcome stories, so the youth learn that there are adults in the neighborhood that want to hear stories, that want to hear about what's going on in their lives. But again, it just kind of changes how do you want to spend your time during the week? And those kind of habits shift who's talking with whom and how do we discern what God's up to. Yeah, thanks, Mary. You're right. She just notes that sometimes it's a little tricky helping people realize that their stories are valuable and somebody wants to listen to them. And that really does take, how do we convey that we really are listening? There's a lot more going by, SJ. I'm going to let you do some sorting here.
Yeah, so just as a note, so I am not Sally, I'm Sarah Jane, and Sally Mann, who I think Mark introduced a little bit at the beginning, teaches at Greenwich sociology and philosophy, I believe, and the videos on YouTube are of her conversation with Al. She just had trouble getting off and on, so you actually can watch the conversation she had with Alan, and there's actually a lot of really good material that you can find on the homepage of the journal. Her story, it's been really great to have Danny and actually Mark telling their stories, because her story was sort of an entry point into the conversation today, and it's been wonderful to hear from Danny and Mark as other stories of Acts 16 and how we're listening beyond the walls and what those practices look like. So that's been really great. Some other questions here. I find is this from Barry? I face the tension from the theologically trained folks when they may dismiss stories in favor of what Scripture says. Comments. So how are we integrating our posture around Scripture and stories and how those interplay?
Well, my first response, which I would draw, is that if they are theologians and they are down on stories, they need to start all over again because
Don't read the Bible.
The Scripture is one huge set of stories. It's inside the stories. I mean, Jesus goes around telling stories. So, I think part of it is that, I'll say this and I'll stop. We're at the 500th year of a certain tradition called the Reformations. And unfortunately, those events took place inside the birth of something called rationalism and an objectification of things. And so there's been a dismissal of the ordinary and the stories that are present, but that's where God's Spirit's at work. So I think the challenge here is a lot of people, including some of us on this, who are theologically trained, were theologically trained in a world that actually is antithetical to biblical imagination.
Yeah, so that rationalism issue is a key. You and I've talked about this a little bit, that often when people think theology, they're thinking systematic theology, rationalized theology, which is a particular mode and method of doing theology. And I think it's important, but I think that's an important auxiliary work, that where as a practical theologian, I think real theology is how Sally calls herself, a community theologian. It really is this. How do you bring together stories of the people, the work of the Spirit, the stories of the text, the stories of our tradition? I'll let the other kinds of theology in. But it's doing that, helping a community do that reflective work so that we can discern what God's up to and participate in that. And that's the real on-the-ground theology. It's what you see Paul doing all the time. It's what other biblical texts are doing. They're trying to name things in the midst of life with God and with neighbor. But yeah, if we're basically trying to line it up with rational categories, then those categories will often blind us to God, even though they're called theology. Danny's got a bit of a reputation here. I've had more than one person say that when Danny gets a question, he tells a story. So I'm glad it's in your bones, and therefore it becomes in the bones of your congregation.
Danny, there's a question for you from, I think that we get great for you from Sandra, asking about some of the issues around class and what is integration? What do those practices look like around and across different socioeconomic groups, and what's been sort of maybe some of your experience of that? What's that look like in your context?
I think that the socioeconomic differences are at least as big a barrier, if not a bigger barrier, than cultural differences. Our congregation has tried to reach out broadly. Her question had of providing charity versus opening the door to membership of those sort of different socioeconomic class. We're definitely trying to move away from just doing charity, but on the other hand, I feel like as those who are blessed like we are, we need to give. Maybe there's another. Okay, specifically answer the question of does our congregation have those who are poor? The answer is yes, but they are a smaller number, and you can feel that. And I think that was one of the differences that one of our folks wanted to be drawn on the East meets West. That we're going to talk about socioeconomic differences, but I think there's another category in terms of if we are connected with folks and having real friendship, because see, you come into our doors and you say, I don't feel like I fit. Okay, but can we have other spaces? Our youth ministry for a long time has been that space, and other places that are outside, maybe in homes, you at schools, you make these relationships, and then so you end up doing things like going to the ICE detention center because that family really matters to you. You end up being the person that posts the bail for them in your name because they're undocumented and they don't want to have them listed with the bail folks, and so. So maybe you could say they're not in our congregation, they're not members, but I've started to use this language of our wider community and trying to stretch our definition of church. We have members. The members have stars next to their name in the directory. We also have a lot of other folks who are not formal members that are regular participants in our life. And that's why when folks say, how big is your church? I say, well, depends on how you want. Okay, the easy answer is to say Sunday. But we have a lot of other relationships that are not Sunday. And those relationships, I feel like, are very much the presence of Christ. And so when you get into, like, we have a group, and this is actually pretty intensive work. Every Sunday, there's like 6 of us that in threes go out to a particular home, and actually we carry the wheelchair out of the house because they can't afford to put in a lift. They can't, but we want our sister to be in church. And so 3 folks go out every morning to get her out of the house and bring her to church. And at the end of a 3.5 hour Sunday, another 3 folks go back and carry her back up those stairs. And so we had a homeless person living out in front of our street, like maybe 50 yards from our door. And you say hi to him, you learn his name. And then one day some youth come and they basically harass them. And out of that, there ended up being more relationship and conversation. And so he was invited to come, and we have meals in our space. And so he came and shared those meals. I could tell it's awkward because he feels different from the rest of us. He knows that he lives outside on the street. But we had him for a while until I don't know what happened we heard the story about exactly, but where somehow his little encampment that he made, burned up, and all that he owned got burned up, and then he disappeared. But then we saw him riding his bike down the street again. I said, hey, let's talk, and it's been a while since we've seen him, but he was our neighbor. He was so close to us. He made it into the doors. He shared some meals with us. He came to some services, but no, he didn't make it into the congregation as a member. But I feel like, we have a lot of consistency in our members, but we also have an extended community have also gone a lot of years, and they're not Christian, some of them, and so that's where worship especially isn't something that they feel is very foreign. I say, worship is going to you're like an alien. So we have to create these other spaces, and that's actually what we're trying to move towards now, is doing less in our gathered space and more out in homes, spaces. Yeah.
That's great.
Cheryl, thanks for you actually, could be good to hear you on this, about how this changes the expectations of the role of the pastor and the role of the people, that we've got deep, long habits. Alan's comment on the Reformation, long habits about what the professional clergy person does or doesn't do and what the expectations are. And one advantage you've got is you started with already having broken some of those expectations. They knew that the founding group knew you and knew you were going to mess with some traditions. So you both fit and don't fit some of the traditional Presbyterian roles. Can you name some things that you do that aren't the normal Presbyterian clergy person roles, or in how you spend your time?
When I watched Sally's interview with Alan, she's really the example of that. When I was listening to her tell her story, I feel like in a lot of ways, for those who are out there, maybe if you're a pastor, I feel like I'm a very normal pastor. I preach regularly. I'm the one that preaches the most. We lead worship service that's shared. I mean, it's a very traditional. It feels, we've updated, but it feels like folks who come to us feel like our service is pretty traditional. So like that part we haven't touched too much. I still am very influenced by folks like Eugene Peterson, who tell us about the integrity of pastoral work, and I feel like I have that kind of checking me that it's about scripture and prayer and spiritual direction and contemplative pastor and all that kind. I still have that very much. So I feel like what I've done is that I've tried to create the environment where folks like Chiming and others go out. And I know that when we first moved in the neighborhood, I did a lot more on the street and in places directly, and I do less now. And so I won't say that I'm a normal pastor by any means. Like what you said, somebody asks a theological question and I tell a story. But part of that is my personality, part of that is my culture. And so when I find that it actually dovetails with some of the things that you guys are doing, that was a way of actually realizing, okay, if the normative is Reformation, then maybe I can find, okay, I don't actually naturally fit into that, or at least totally fit into that. And so I find some ways, okay, I can listen to Alan and say, yeah, we're on the right track doing this. And this is not directly answering your question, but I thought about it earlier, is in this kind of tension with theologians. It's not just with theologians. Our youth have grown up in our church where they're used to mystery, they're used to story, they're used to just like open-endedness. And then they'll end up with going to somebody else's youth group and they'll feel like those guys know the Bible, we don't. Well, and they feel the tension of that more rational, it's the Bible that's important, and they get thrown, but they've not known anything other than our congregation. So that's an interesting piece for us. We must be doing something different that when they go out, they recognize. And sometimes they're intimidated because I think people with very clear thinking, rational argument, and if you're in a congregation where the preaching is always, okay, I may be too strong with this, but a lot of times preaching is getting your thinking right. Mm-hmm. Right. And so when you say, are we doing theology? We are, but it's different. And it's much more relational. It's much more story based and giving room for a text to flex. I mean, I think there's better and worse reading of text, but the text is, yes, there's like getting what, I don't know, I think you know what I'm saying. So, but I mean, so we practice differently. And so I guess I'm not just the ordinary a normal Presbyterian pastor, but I do feel like I'm very comfortable in the Reformed tradition, and I'm comfortable in the tradition that we've inherited. So you can see that in us.
Mark,
One of the comments has to do with how people think stories are about making a point.
Yeah.
And that's what you're countering, which is good, that it isn't just, I already know the truth, my stories just illustrate it. Rather than the thing is the story. This is life, and this is where we're being lured into that mystery. Yeah, SJ?
Yeah, no, I was thinking some of these questions seem to be pushing into what Sally was laying the groundwork for, which was she was really pushing at our understanding of church leadership or being in a community in some pretty provocative kinds of ways, and saying some pretty provocative things. And so a lot of the illustrations and conversations we're having are around practices and ways of going about this, which I think are really helpful. I think Sally was being a bit more of a disruptive presence in terms of the things he was pushing at. Mm-hmm. And I see some of these questions coming up, and I think they all connect. So I'm wondering if for those who have seen that part, which is the second video, what is this? What are the implications of this beyond the billboard metaphor image for leadership? And what does that look like on the ground? And perhaps there's, maybe it's you and Danny and Mark, you want to have some comments around that. But what are some of those ways that Sally's been pushing us to really question some of, and also embrace some new practices and ways of living into leading and pastoring in some quite different ways.
Well, I like the way that she, as she says, she's a professor, she's a philosopher, but she's not even a normal philosophy professor, right? She does this stuff, and part of it is she's in a mixed ethnic community, and so her students are that, and she connects beyond the classroom. But simply the way she thinks about that network, that world, is informed by both the world and her faith, right? So while it's a Baptist tradition, most Baptists wouldn't recognize all that Sally's doing. She's not paid by the church. Our pastor, her main job is she works with a transition center for homeless families. And so that's really your day in and day out life with our neighborhood and our neighbors. And that changes how she sees and connects and leads us because of the relationship she has, and therefore what kind of connection she makes with us.
That's a huge issue, Mark, in that, and it's kind of the skeleton that we don't want to talk about, is that a lot of this, to use Sally's metaphor of the billboard, is about class. It's about middle class Christians and churches who have a certain view of a minister. And we're never going to get past this until, frankly, we stop this thing about full-time paid clergy. That's a huge one. The other one, for me, about practice is it's the notion of the local as the soil in which we live. And most middle-class churches see it as the opportunity for them to do something for people. And so how do leaders demonstrate a fundamentally different stance, not doing for, but being gardeners in a soil and living in a soil? To me, these are some critical pieces.
Yeah, I'd agree. I've never, well, it's been a long time since I was full-time employed by church, but I still have been, in the vernacular Christian professional. My salaries generally come either there. I was dean of an African-American Bible church not far from Danny's church. And now as a professor in a seminary. But my church life then, what that does is it frees me to be a neighbor in the neighborhoods, where I bring the resources and I benefit from my employment. And so historically, it's still in some places, we look to people like Danny, where we've got the benefit of somebody who really, we're saying, do this theology for us, right? mess with us, tell the stories, tell the Bible stories, tell the neighborhood stories, listen to us, which is what you do. But I'd also agree with Alan that I'm seeing increasingly that Danny's unusual in that he's able to do this even though he is full-time salaried. Most people I'm finding who are full-time salaried get so locked into other habits that that this becomes not the normal pattern. But there's a way your people caught this virus from early on that is, it's different than what I've seen with a church like what Redeemer is.
Well, and if you say you as in you, Redeemer Church, then I definitely think we are living into this, these practices. But I do say that for myself as my primary work, my primary calling being pastor, I'm always challenged by those questions of should you be full-time? Should you be half-time? Should you be more in the neighborhood? And I find, like I said earlier on, I try to do more of that. I think it's also a matter of gifts and personality. Relational stuff takes a lot of energy out of me. And so I feel like for me to push myself in that, I can't do as much. So when I heard, Sally's stories, I thought that was wonderful how she went, but I also feel like, oh, I can't do that. But I don't know if anybody else feels that way. Well, how do I make time? How do I make time? And I said, well, I guess one way to make time is if you actually structured it in that, okay, you're part-time, you're bivocational. And so then you can choose your vocation, choose your other work to be relational. But then even that, if I had other work, if I was doing, would I really be an on the ground kind of a person, or would I still be in a equipping kind of a role? I suspect that if I went back to consulting, it wouldn't be my neighborhood. It would still be these professional clients and stuff. So I would still have to make space to be in my neighborhood. I found the most that I can be in my neighborhood is through my kids, coach soccer, and just get involved with, and there's a whole set of families that go with that. And so that's where I'm mostly, but I don't want to give off the story that somehow I'm way in the neighborhood, because I feel like our church is, and there are certain folks that are very gifted at that. And they kind of lead out for us, listen for us, and find openings for us to enter in. So.
Mm-hmm.
Danny and Mark, we're just about finished here. I'm wondering if you have any final comments that you want to leave us all with before we finish up.
One is, if you haven't listened to those interviews with Sally online, please do, as well as read her brief article on Billboard. She's an amazing friend, and just a lot of fun to engage. And story. When we had our editorial meetings in Toronto a year and a half ago, Sally said that was her first time in Canada. So I thought, okay, that's believable. And now, then we had our meetings in Birmingham this last summer, which is what, an hour and a half from London, SJ?
It's not far. It's not that far. Not when you're from North America. It's not that far.
Major city, and she said, I've never been here before. So when Sally talks about being a located theologian in East London, she really means it. She's just there all the time, and just thrives there and loves others there, is deeply loved there. So anyway, there's the locality issues I think you're hearing from all of us really do matter, and she's an inspiration in that way. Danny too, where you've had more and more members that are looking at how do they live near the church, into the community, because not all, you were more scattered as you came together and decided on a place. So same kind of thing, that there's something about geography and place and soil that we all are finding out matters for this gospel work.
Maybe I'll just make brief comments, a couple of questions that were here, and some of them were directed to me. So the one about congregation connecting with people in the space where they work, study, and play and live. Do we have that? Sure. But it needs to be intentional. We had a Luke 10 group, because Luke 10 is normally you join in one neighborhood, but we had an alternative Luke 10 group for people who would intentionally go to the other places. We looked for those overlaps, but maybe doing this kind of jump started them into regular practice, and it is intentional. It's like when I can't make excuses for not connecting with people, even if it's not my my personality. And then there was a question here about that when sometimes we feel like we tell stories to make sermon illustrations. And I just totally resonate with what Alan was saying about the story. We're living this, the gospel story. You know, we're inhabiting this gospel. It's all story. We're part of the story. We're characters in this drama. You know, and we're folks that are named and known, and the people that we're meeting are named and known by God. We're all characters, and we don't know, like in any good story, any good novel, the characters develop, and you're surprised by the interaction, surprised where the story goes. And so I think it's really fun to feel like, well, the gospel is a story that God is continuing to tell and write, and I get to have some small little part of it. Is humbling, but also very exciting. I want to know what's the next chapter. Let's turn that page in. So.
Let me one was a request for resources. You may know some, but there's a question about resources for helping people tell stories. One is, without being too self-promoting, Appreciative Inquiry has been an important tool for us, and I know we engaged that with you all. So my book on Memories, Hopes, Conversations also tells stories of 5 other congregations. And Appreciative Inquiry is simply a way to tell stories that is non-threatening. And in our neighborhood, we'll just basically tell us a story about something that happened in the neighborhood that you love. You know, what's been something encouraging about life here for us in Pasadena, Altadena. So there's just ways of asking positive, encouraging questions. They'll get into other stories. When people want to get into stories of wounds and such, that's important. But just learning to ask questions and listen. And so that's what we did on the cultural questions. Tell us something about your culture, how you understood culture growing up, when that matters to you and is something you value. Although we also ask there for the other question, you know, are there some stories of woundedness around culture that you'd like to tell your table? So it just depends upon the depth of the relationship, the occasion, the place, the setting. But these kind of questions that invite an open-ended response, and being able to become good storytellers, just practicing on each other to tell stories of our own lives. That's what Paul would do. My guess is, I doubt if he recited any Westminster Confession when he'd be talking about Jesus. He just would have been telling stories about Jesus. And I find that that's not an unwelcome thing, that often people are more than willing to engage and listen to faith stories rather than concepts. So all glad. Thanks, SJ, for that blurb there. I think, is our time up? This has been Danny.
Thank you, folks. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all for joining. We'll send out a quick thank you email, and we do encourage you to watch those videos from Sally if you haven't had a chance. And we'll have more of these types of conversations. Thank you for participating.
Yeah, we will. Thanks, SJ.